And the third country with an authoritarian government that we need to be aware of is Japan. Japan shares similarities with both Italy and Germany. Japan became a powerful westernized country by the late 19th century. Like Italy and Germany, Japan did not have a long history of democracy, and during the 1930s, the Japanese people widely favored an authoritarian government and started to look for ways to expand their territory. During the 1920s, it seemed as though Japan was becoming more democratic and starting to embrace the values of the West. All men got the right to vote in 1925. There were political parties. Japan was really becoming a country of the world. But when the Great Depression hit, Japan was very hard hit as well. And like in Germany, the Great Depression helped pave the way for the rise of a more authoritarian government. One of Japan's main industries was the production of silk, which is really a luxury product, and in hard times the demand for luxury products plummets, and this ended up making millions of people who lived in the countryside poor. Japanese exports fell. People who worked in cities had to return to their villages, only to find that conditions weren't much better in the villages. There was no food. Many girls were sold into prostitution to buy food. So these hard times really forced people to reconsider the merits of capitalism. And the hard economic times gave a voice to a movement in Japan known as radical nationalism, or the revolutionary right. And these people were extremely nationalistic, anti-democratic. They wanted to create a dictatorship under the rule of the Japanese emperor, and wanted to expand Japan's territory and really conquer the entire South Pacific. Like in Germany, there were assassinations of liberal democratic politicians, and in a lot of ways it was similar to fascism and Nazism. There were some key differences as well. For one, in Japan, there's no charismatic leader equivalent to Mussolini in Italy or Hitler in Germany. There was much less of an internal struggle between Japanese people. There was much less violence within Japan. People convicted of political crimes in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy were murdered. In Japan, they were more likely to be subjected to a process called resocialization, where they were taken away, brought to a camp, and brought around to see the mistakes in their thinking. So, in the 1930s, Japanese society was changing to reflect this growing nationalistic and authoritarian sentiment. The military became much more powerful. The government was censoring free expression. There was only one news agency that had the right to distribute news, and this was a state-run news agency. Unions were eliminated to eliminate the threat of communism. Like in Italy and Germany, the Ministry of Education issued new textbooks for all schools, and the textbooks stressed that Japanese people were superior, that they were different from Westerners and better than Westerners. And the textbooks explain that the Emperor of Japan is divine. He is appointed from heaven. So the government of Japan is from heaven, whereas the government of Western nations is just based on a contractual relationship between the people and the leader. So the Japanese relationship with their leader is a much more natural relationship. But what really put the world on the path to war was that Japan and Germany wanted to grow. They each wanted their own powerful empire. Japan in the South Pacific, Germany in Europe, eventually maybe even the entire world. So once these countries made up their mind that this is what they were going to do, that they were going to build empires, there was really no stopping the Second World War. In 1931, the Japanese military, acting independent of the Japanese government, took control of Chinese territory called Manchuria. And in Manchuria, they set up their own military state called Manchukuo. This really upset Western powers and ultimately led to Japan leaving the League of Nations and allying themselves with Germany and Italy. And then in 1937, Japan launched a full-scale attack on China, and this is really the beginning of the Asian side of World War II. So World War II starts first in Asia and later in Europe. Japan's decision to go to war with China and to try to conquer China was very unpopular around the world, but for their part, the Japanese weren't interested in playing by the rules of the West anymore. The Japanese were convinced that the West was racist and that they would never willingly let Japan become a major world power, so it was something that they were going to have to fight for. Now, for Japan, they had a lot of ambition to be one of the world's great superpowers, but they didn't have the resources to do this. So Japan is a group of smallish islands. Japan doesn't possess all the natural resources that a country like Russia or Britain or the United States or China has access to. And Japan was heavily dependent on importing things from other countries. So the Japanese took a look around them and looked at their neighbors, and what they saw were their Asian neighbors being exploited by European powers and the Americans. So Western powers controlled all the resources in Southeast Asia. Japan needed resources to grow their empire, and the way this was pitched to the Japanese public is that they needed these resources to survive. The survival of the nation was at stake here. So in 1940 and 1941, Japan expanded their military expeditions from China to include other places in the South Pacific. So they went to Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, which was controlled by the French. They went to Burma, which was a colony of Great Britain. They went to Indonesia, which was a colony of the Dutch. They went to the Philippines, which belonged to the United States. And all of these military expeditions were done with the end goal of becoming a dominant power in the South Pacific and freeing themselves from dependency on the West. When Japan arrived in these places, Indonesia, Indochina, the Philippines, Burma, they always presented themselves as liberators who were freeing the local people from their European or American oppressors, that they were creating a new Asia for Asians. But it became clear quickly that they were going to rule at least as brutally as the European and American colonists had. So Japan's desire to expand is at the root of the conflict in the Pacific, but this Pacific conflict was secondary for Western powers until December 1941, when the Japanese decided to bring the war to the Americans by bombing Pearl Harbor, which was an American military base in Hawaii. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought the United States into a long and bloody conflict in the Pacific, which only ended with the dropping of the atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. So, if Japan was the angry Asian power that wanted more territory, Germany was definitely the European equivalent. So, just to recap Germany, citizens of Germany were furious over the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Before the war, Germany was emerging as a world power. The treaty really reduced Germany to a third-rate country and basically laid out that Germany would never again be a world power. But the Nazis successfully used these resentments, and the Nazis pledged that they would make things right for Germans. The Nazis scapegoated Jews and communists and blamed them for problems within Germany. The Nazis promoted war as a noble thing. War was something to be celebrated, and it was through war that superior people rose to the top. Germans were superior people, and they were going to naturally rise to the top. So, embedded in this ideology is a desire to expand the territory of Germany. And the term Hitler used for this component of Nazism was Lebensraum, which means living space. Hitler, like the Japanese militarists, argued that Germany must acquire more territory, and his plan involved conquering territory in the lands to the east of Germany. So territory in Poland and Czechoslovakia and Russia, or the Soviet Union, and eventually this was going to require war. But Hitler started slow. He quietly started rebuilding the German military in 1935, and this was forbidden under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, but he did it anyway. The next year, in 1936, German forces entered the Rhineland, which, according to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, was meant to be a demilitarized zone, so there's no army, no military allowed in there. Slowly at first, then more aggressively, Hitler was getting Germany prepared for war. In 1938, Germany conquered Austria and German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia. So all these actions were completely against the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, but the last thing that the other powers in Europe wanted was a Second World War. After Germany took over territory in Czechoslovakia, European powers met with Hitler in Munich to talk the situation over. And basically what ends up happening at the Munich conference is these other world leaders say, okay, you weren't supposed to do that, but I guess you can keep that territory in Czechoslovakia, I guess you can keep Austria, but that's it. So they gave in to Hitler because they thought that he would be happy and stop bullying his neighbors around. This might be partly because the general sentiment by now was that the terms of the Treaty of Versailles were unfair, and this was going to make up for it a little bit. This was going to make things a little more fair. The term that is used for this now is appeasement. The European powers were trying to appease Hitler so he didn't cause any more trouble, and it was a terrible failure. The year after the Munich conference in 1939, Germany goes on to invade Poland to get more territory, always after more territory, and this is what triggers the Second World War in Europe. So very quickly, Germany, with the help of Italy, were able to sweep through Europe, the Western Soviet Union, and North Africa. So they're able to bring most of Europe under Nazi control. The tide begins to turn against the Germans in 1942 with the USSR and their armies so massive they're able to absorb German attacks. So of all the countries, it was the USSR that suffered the greatest casualties. The United States would eventually join the war against Germany in 1942, but it was 3 more years of fighting before Germany was defeated in May 1945.